Ready to go.
I'm actually going to wear my hat today as the interim director of the Urban Water Institute and hopefully give you kind of a good overview, but it's definitely going to be, I don't know, maybe the 10,000 foot view of water from the urban perspective and kind of some of the issues that we're struggling with at a real high up level. I always start when I talk about water with this, and I think it's something that we've known since we were very small children, the water cycle. I think I started going to my children's classrooms when my kids were in preschool, and we would sing songs about the water cycle. So it's not new information, but I start my talks with this just to kind of remind us that water goes in a cycle, and that there are many places where we can kind of work with that cycle to gain benefit from the water. And also that it is a finite resource, and we're not creating more water on Earth, so we need to really think about conserving what we have. So just a reminder from way back days, maybe. Water has been identified as one of the most critical resources. Basically, if we don't have water, we don't have life. And as we think about some of these issues that we're facing, we have a huge challenge with water in the urban perspective. Our world population is projected to reach 9 billion by 2050. We are already over 7 billion people. In the United States, this second bullet here is for the United States, we will have the number of people living in cities double. This very much changes the relationship that we have as a human species and our landscape. We will be needing to convert more of our land for food production. We will have a higher water consumption, not only for that food production, but also for our energy generation and our own health and welfare. In the state of Kansas, we are struggling with a limited water resource in the western part of the state, the Ogallala Aquifer, which happens to produce a vast majority of food. There are 8 counties in the western part of the state that are responsible for more than 2/3 of the state's economy based around agriculture. But then that is feeding the rest of the state and the rest of the world from food perspective as well as the economic engine. We have proposed a canal, the state has proposed a canal, that would carry water from our more water-rich part, eastern part of the state, to the western part of the state to maintain that. That's some interesting things to think about with respect to how we want to move water around, and do we really want to move water around. We're also overlaying all of these issues with water. We have climate change issues. We're having more extreme events, both from limited water. We've been in a drought situation in the Midwest. California is certainly in the news right now for horrific droughts, which are impacting our food supply, as well as extreme wet conditions. Kansas City flooded both in 2011 and 2012 and had horrific floods due to the Missouri River flooding. So we've got a lot of things that we're dealing with respect to change that creates challenges with water. Again, tying back to that concept that water is a limited resource. While more than 2/3 of the globe is covered by water, the vast majority of that water is in our oceans. We do have engineering technology. We do have desalination where we can create useful water from that saline or salt water, but at a very high cost. So if we look at what is truly available to us, it's less than 0.25% that is in the form that we could readily use for our food production and our own health. So again, before we start in, this is one of the urban streams in Kansas City. This is actually, a lot of my work revolves around maintaining these natural systems in urban environments. And so to help school-age children appreciate that water is a finite resource and it's a very valuable resource and is more than just, let's say, the water that we drink, but it also is the environment that we live in and the kind of that life-sustaining system of the ecosystem. Okay. Talk a little bit more about change. First, thinking a little bit about land cover change. And if we think back to that water cycle, we know that as we have precipitation, we then get runoff from the land cover surface. As we go through this urbanization process, we're converting our natural landscape into parking lots of super Walmarts and roads and houses. And that very much changes that natural cycle that we are dealing with. And so it changes our runoff rates and volumes, so how we have to manage that water in the urban environment. It changes surface temperatures, and it changes erosion potential. Just a couple of figures here to give an idea of how much influence we as a species, the human species, have had on the landscape. Don't need to get into too much detail here, but what this is an indication of human influence. So it's how much of the land cover have we changed away from kind of that what naturally would have been there. And you can see in the wet part of the United States, on the eastern half of the United States, we have had a significant impact and converted. Much of that landscape has been changed. The more arid region, actually this is still a lot of agricultural production, but a lot of this then is more grazing lands. We have less of an impact where we have less water. You can also see the developed areas of Western Europe, India, China. So we've had a huge influence across the landscape as we go through kind of urbanization processes. If we kind of focus in on just the state of Kansas, you can see this kind of darker golden color is cropland. We have converted the vast majority of our state to cropland. And while that doesn't have the same impact as these hot spots of red, where we have the Wichita area, we have the Topeka area, Lawrence, Kansas City, Manhattan, all of these land conversions start to impact that water cycle. It changes our ability to infiltrate that water in a natural way, to naturally feed our streams, to prevent soil erosion. So we start to see a change. When we go from this natural ground cover, where we would have about half of our water typically would infiltrate, it very much depends on the soil type, but we get a very good amount of infiltration. A lot of our water is lost to evaporation, and we have a very little bit of runoff. As we go through that conversion process, when we get a completely built out city, you can see we have very little infiltration. That's the water that feeds our streams. So many of our urban streams actually are dry most of the time, and then when it rains, we have this large volume of runoff, which leads to large volumes of water in our urban waterways, and a lot of erosion, a lot of damage. So it's very difficult to kind of engineer these systems properly such that we don't have damage. I'm going to show you a series of pictures here in a little bit that kind of highlights that process. Okay, on top of this land cover change and this shift from a natural system that's kind of in balance with itself to more maybe agricultural production systems, then to these urban systems, we also have going on this climate change process. If we look at this as a publication, it's getting a little bit dated now, but we can see that comparing the beginning of this century to a 30-year normal climate period of 1951 to 1980, the majority of the globe is warming. Okay, so we are seeing temperatures on average increasing across the globe. If we come down and we kind of take this into an urban stormwater system, the city of Chicago is a very green city. They actually embrace green infrastructure and the use of what I would call sustainable stormwater management quite readily. This shows one of their city workers on one of the green roofs. Chicago has a lot of green roofs. They have what they call green alleys, where they use porous pavement in their alleys to help infiltration. So they've worked very hard at trying to incorporate these natural processes back into the city. One of the interesting things is that they're changing their plant palette. So the vegetation that was native to the Chicago region, the vegetation that I would always preach as being the right vegetation to use if we think about green infrastructure, is now not able to survive the climate in Chicago. It doesn't get cold enough for that vegetation. So Chicago now has a planting palette for their green infrastructure that includes plants that have that are more heat tolerant. So again, just a shift in heat in the heat island of the city, but causes a shift in how they have to think about their green infrastructure management. If we come to Kansas and we look at the long-term rainfall in Kansas, Climate change is predicting that we will have more intense storms farther apart, but we're also seeing in Kansas that we're getting a little bit of an increase across time. So we're seeing a little bit of rainfall increase on average across the state. And from an engineering perspective, what this does for me is I look to see the take-home message from this is if it's red, the storms are getting bigger. Okay? So if you look, this last map here compares the design criteria that we've used for stormwater management up until about a year ago. The NOAA just published some new numbers about a year ago for Kansas. Up until that time, we used design guidance that was published in 1961. When I say design guidance, they do statistical analysis of weather events, and they say on average, Kansas is going to get, in Manhattan, every 2 years we get about 3.5 inches of rain on average, okay? So we would design our stormwater systems to handle that amount of water. The fact that this is red here says that over 84% of the state, on average, now has a larger storm every 2.5 years to deal with. So the design criteria as a stormwater engineer that we're using, we are now need to design for a larger storm. So there's more money invested in that, more land area that needs to be put into these systems. Okay, so we're seeing a change in how we're even having to engineer our systems. If we look kind of at more traditional systems, what that means, it means potentially larger pipes underneath the ground to carry that away. So it's a higher dollar value. Or it means taking more space and putting into kind of green infrastructure systems. This is something that the city of Manhattan has just done over off of Claflin. So larger storage areas where we can hold that water as these storms increase. Okay. So I want to go through a little bit of a story if you think about urban water issues. And this is Manhattan. So let's see. If we're, this is Kimball Avenue. This is Seth Childs coming here, kind of on this curve. This is Seco Park right here. Take note of this little area here, which back in 1991 was a small grain. They had wheat, and this little guy right, this is a poultry operation. This area here to the west, so keep a look on those. So 1991, we go forward about 2 decades. We now have Venesta and Colbert Hills in that western area. Over here in the east, we have Anthony Middle School and my neighborhood. So we're over here on the east. We're going to kind of focus in on this point here. It is not the drainage point for this entire area, but it does drain the vast majority of this side over here and a small portion over here. Again, we have changed that land cover. We went from 1991, where we had native prairie grasses and soils with no impervious cover, to 2 decades later, having much of that landscape be covered with roads and houses and schools. And we're going to look at the impact here. This is called a hydrograph. And what this shows is at a given point in a stream or a river, I would measure the discharge over time. As we go through a storm event, we may have a base flow in our river. Our river is traveling along at a nice level. As that storm event occurs and we have runoff coming off of our streets and into our storm sewers and dumping into our rivers and our surface water bodies, we see that the level of that creek is going to rise. So what this shows is this shows an increased volume. So this would be we're going towards flood stage, where we're increasing the volume of water that channel is carrying per unit time. Okay. So in a pre-urban system, we typically see a much lower peak, meaning that water is slowed down on the landscape. It starts to infiltrate and soak into the soil. So we see a lower peak, which also translates to less energy, less erosion in our channels. Sometimes, not always, but we'll see that the area underneath this curve is also maybe a little bit lower. And that would mean that that water never reached the storm during that period of time. So the volume of water that actually leaves the landscape is calculated by integrating the area underneath the curve. Typically speaking, the area underneath the red curve is going to be greater, and it's also going to come sooner. So I have more water, quicker time frame, which equates to more energy and more erosion. Okay, so we go back, we take a look. Okay, here we are. Here's our watershed. Remember, this used to be Prairie. This used to be a small grain farm. And we're going to focus here at the outlet or the entrance into a stormwater system. Back at the beginning, when that subdivision that was just off that map, that subdivision was established in the early 1960s. Dr. Steichen and I have a previous colleague who owned a home along this waterway, Morgan Powell. And Dr. Powell's children used to play. It was put in, this is not a picture of that grass waterway, but it was put in as a grass waterway. So as they developed that land and they built houses on that land, they put a storm sewer system that had what we would call a surface conveyance that was to move water off of the landscape. And they vegetated that swale, and his children played in this, on this. This was part of the football field in the neighborhood for the kids. Okay, so this is where the star is on the map. This is where we are. We're at the south end of Seco Park. This is a very traditional input to a storm sewer in an urban environment. It's called a boxed culvert, so it's just a big concrete tube of pipe. This down here, sometimes we'll call those dragon's teeth. In a traditional system, we put those in to slow the water down. So we've got really fast water that's been moving off of the parking lots and out of the storm sewer into this area. So we want to slow that water down. So we're trying to dissipate that energy by creating turbulence with these dragon's teeth. Okay, here's another picture of the dragon's teeth. So again, imagine we're coming out of pipes. We have a lot of turbulence right here. This is going to slow the water down and reintroduce the water to this surface conveyance of a grass waterway, of that nice grass channel. So my nice grass channel failed. As we continued to build up into Candlewood, and we continued to build up into Venesta, that was not taken into account, that change in the water cycle that we would have due to that land cover change. As the channels started to fail, their first attempt to stabilize the system was to add riprap, to add large rock. Large rock is going to be able to dissipate energy. That water's going to hit it and in theory bounce off of the large rock, slow down, protect the sides of that channel from further channel erosion. When the large rock doesn't give us the stability that we want, many times my most favorite best management practice is the puking of the concrete. So if rock is not strong enough to withstand the flow of the water and it gets washed downstream, we will further stabilize this system by dumping a bunch of concrete on top of it. And that is what they have done here. And you can kind of see now, here's my large rock, and I've got that light gray concrete. What happens when that water still continues to come and I have energy that has to go somewhere? This is now stable. The sides are not eroding anymore. But what happens, the soil underneath is still not stable. So we continue to down cut. And you can see here that there is a little bit, there's erosion going on right here. What will ultimately happen is this underneath, the soil underneath this will erode away. It will weaken the concrete's ability to hold that heavy rock. We'll get a fracture somewhere along the line. It will break off, fall into the channel, and then we'll have riprap on the bottom of the channel that can be kind of worn away and sent downstream. Here's my grass channel. It's now about 8 feet deep. This, anybody know what this is? That pipe right there?
Sewer?
It is. It's the sewer line. When we put the subdivision in, that sewer line would have been 3 to 4 feet below the land surface, okay? So we have eroded away enough soil that it is now exposed by about 6 feet above grade. Right here, we've got the natural gas line. Also would have been below grade. Now, because of the erosion, is above grade. A house on the channel, an attempt to stabilize the system. We end up with, I believe this house has been condemned because you can't stabilize. There's too much water coming through. Okay. So that comes to what are some of the solutions. So there's a large problem, and if you start to think about solutions, we really need to get together groups of people to think about all of the challenges that we're facing with water in the urban environment, from the stormwater management to the water distribution systems, to the energy taken around all these systems, and think about how can we work together, work with the natural processes in order to produce solutions. So kind of evolving around that idea, in 2011, Kansas State established the Urban Water Institute on the Olathe campus in Kansas City, much because of the proximity to the Kansas City metro area and the fact that about 20% of the state's citizens live in that area. So we have kind of a perfect outdoor laboratory to assess a lot of these different issues across the landscape, and then to work with the local communities about solutions. So the vision of this institute was that it would be a center of knowledge, research, and engagement focused on sustainable water management in urban environments. We're very interested in looking to establish what I call a one water system. So understanding that we have one water source and that it flows across the landscape. It really doesn't care whether or not it's in Johnson County or whether or not it's in Wyandotte County, if it's in this little town or that little town. It follows its own natural boundaries. It doesn't follow political boundaries, and we need to work within that system. We work in the Kansas City area to promote treatment technologies, management approaches, and public policy to create lasting impacts in urban environments. So if we are successful, and we have just, the Institute is relatively new and still trying to get things going, but looking to establish policies that will develop economies based on available water. We have a set amount of water in Kansas. It is my personal belief and that of the Institute that we should develop our economy based on what we have. We cannot create new water sources, and I personally believe that inter-basin transfer is kind of a crazy idea. It hasn't worked at any time throughout history, from the Romans to the Central Arizona Project. So develop our economy based on what we have available to us. Have sustainable use of water to increase water security and food security. So develop methods that allow us to support sustainable use of water for all of the citizens, whether we're in the urban environment or the rural environment, but also know that there are other uses for that water, primarily food production, but then also energy production that we need. And then lastly, to establish practices that will be based off of kind of ecological and scientific principles that will allow us to mitigate the radical swings of water availability. So getting away from heavily engineered systems which tend to confine and are designed for a specific amount of water, and moving towards more resilient green infrastructure that has the capability to expand and shrink based on water availability. For example, like wetland systems or bioretention cells. So current research areas, a lot of this is my research, but I have a little bit from others. We're really looking at integrated food production systems and then restoring prairie ecosystem function for urban stormwater management. The picture that this is over the top of is actually a site in Topeka, Kansas, where we reestablished what we would call kind of a prairie restoration system. This is an area of Topeka that is a very old area. It's called Quinton Heights. It is just west of Topeka Boulevard on about 25th, so just south of the Expo Center, if you know Topeka at all. Established in 1895, no storm sewers, a lot of flooding, fairly hilly area. We actually worked with the city. They condemned a house on this lot so that they could gain storage, and we gained storage through reestablishing the natural prairie function of being able to infiltrate that excess water and move it slowly off of the landscape. Since this went in, prior to this going in, it took about an inch of rainfall to wash out 5 driveways. Every time it rained an inch, the city replaced 5 driveways at the bottom of the hill. Since this has gone in, the driveways haven't washed out at all. So we're about a decade in, and even all of the rainstorms that we've had, and we've had some rainstorms significantly larger than 1 inch over that decade in Topeka, they've not replaced driveways. So that's pretty cool. If we look a little bit at food systems, you know, the urban sector, I'm very interested in how we can kind of weave all of these pieces together. And so we've been working with a gentleman on, actually on Kansas City, Missouri. This is not his system. This was this summer in my lab over in Seton Hall, but looking at aquaponics systems. This gentleman in Kansas City, Missouri, he runs an aquaponics system where he does rainwater capture off of about 200 square feet of solar panel. He runs his entire farming operation off of the energy that he generates from the solar panel, and he runs his entire aquaponics system off of the water that he captures from that system, from those solar panels. He's able to produce about 1,000 pounds of tilapia every 6 weeks in just over 1,000 gallons of water. So pretty impressive system, and it's in an area that's considered a food desert, and so he's trying to reinvigorate like food production and healthy eating in a fairly blighted area of Kansas City. He's working with a group, and we're kind of helping out, where they're going to soon get about 10,000 square feet of an old armory, also on the Missouri side of the river, but they will be growing lettuce in that system hydroponically. And so, again, trying to reintroduce local food supply in the urban environment using recaptured water and renewable energy sources. I tend to spend most of my time out in the environment trying to reestablish that prairie ecosystem function in the urban environment, looking for pockets, whether it's vegetated islands or depressions in parking lots. Prefer depressions, not islands. So it's so we can create a bioretention cell in a parking lot or on the edge of the super Walmart, or whether we're actually tearing down houses and building larger systems, but again, looking for pockets where I can reestablish prairie ecosystem function. And if you remember back to Dr. Moore's talk on ecosystem services, we're trying to do more than just gain that function of water management. We're trying to also help it reestablish a lot of those ecosystem services inside the cities. I've just got a couple examples, and then I'll probably have plenty of time for questions. This is an interesting example that I worked with, and it's actually coming up on its 10-year anniversary this next summer, and it still functions very well. So this is Jackson Street. You can see here's the State Capitol building. This is the east side of the State Capitol building. Jackson Street runs north-south towards the river. This is what it looked like back in 2000. It was a 3-lane street. Downtown Topeka had horrific flooding due to an undersized storm sewer. Underneath all of the city streets of downtown Topeka, they had 3-foot diameter storm sewer. There was an engineering study that was commissioned by the city, and they came back and they said, well, in order to handle the volume of water that you are currently seeing, and again, remember this volume of water is shifting on us as we have these more extreme events, you need to take all of your 3-foot pipe and you need to increase the size to a 5-foot diameter pipe. It's going to take about 2 years to tear up every street in downtown Topeka and reestablish this system. With a price tag of, I don't remember the exact numbers. I can tell you the difference between, I'll give you that in a minute, but a hefty price tag to go through this. So not only do we go through a lot of construction, a very long construction time frame, but we also have a very significant price tag attached to that. The man that worked in Topeka at that time that was in charge of their stormwater was a man named Mark Green, and he'd been hearing some rumblings of this green infrastructure stuff that was going on in other places around the country. And I had started to have a little bit of contact with Mark. I was fairly new on the faculty here, and he says, can we do this? And I said, oh, I think we can. So we worked together, took a lot of discussion and a lot of talk, but this far left lane, which is now here, we actually created 19 bioretention cells. Each of these little gardens has 4 foot deep of soil. There are 19 of them. They are connected together hydraulically, both subsurface with the traditional storm sewer is still there, as well as surface. So if we have a very, very large rainfall event, this would actually serve as a surface stream. So that these connections where we have the connection with the driveway, those are actually weirs that would keep that water flowing down the side of the street, not flood the street, and serve as a surface stream. Some of the issues we dealt with, there was no way we were going to get away with no curb and gutter. The snow removal and the city maintenance folks said no, 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 no. So we had to work with how are we actually going to get inlets into the system. You can see here, so we have cutaway. We do have quite a bit of rock at these cutaway to dissipate some of that energy as it's coming into those systems. We worked with landscape architects to pick vegetation that would be kind of aesthetically pleasing but also natural. You can't see in any of these pictures, but we have in each of these cells there is what we call a beehive drain. So there is an overflow drain, so as the system does start to flood or hold water, they do overflow. The really cool thing about that is we built those with the capacity to actually raise the drain. So as those grasses grow and the root biomass increases and the infiltration capacity goes up, we can actually pond more water in those systems now to get more infiltration. So it's a pretty cool system. I'll say one of the issues today I taught my class right before this, ecological engineering design, and we had some discussion about finding a good contractor. And so there were lots of stories. These are some of the very first. They're not the first because Topeka had 2 other bioretention cells when these were actually completed. But those were the first in the state of Kansas. So we're not talking too many people that understood what we were trying to do or how they needed to do it. The contractors used these areas as parking for their vehicle staging as they were doing some other things. When we went to auger in for some of these trees, they actually sheared off the auger because the soil had been so compacted. So that was one thing we had to have a lot of discussion with the contractor is we don't want a parking lot here. We want this to infiltrate. We want to grow vegetation. We want to use this as a sponge for water. So it's been some educating in how some of these systems have to go into the ground. So there's one example of a system. And another example, you can see pieces of this concept. Unfortunately, you can't quite see this exact. So this is Seton Hall. This is actually on top of the building. If you walk through Seton Hall, though, the breezeway that connects the west wing of Seton Hall with the original building that's just across from the Student Union, you will see on the west side of that breezeway what we call an extensive green roof. This is an intensive green roof. An extensive green roof grows lower vegetation. That vegetation is nice. It actually comes in little trays and you just kind of plug it in. So it's kind of like putting tiles on your roof. Again, the idea here, though, is that you create a little bit of a sponge to store some of that rainwater. If we were on a roof structure that where you were actually taking the inlet for your air conditioning system on the roof, the temperature over the top of a living system is typically 10 to 15 degrees cooler in the middle of the summer than on an inert roof, so just a shingle roof or a plastic roof system. On top of Seton Hall, we actually did a system where there's about 8 inches of soil in the middle, actually growing media. It's a lot of vermiculite and inert material to be lighter. One of the issues with green roofs is that it can be heavy, but we've got the growing media, and the vast majority of these plants are native prairie plants. I will do full disclosure when Lee Scablin, I should say, and Lee is the kind of the designer for this in landscape architecture. My students and I worked with Lee to install all of this. We did have an irrigation system up there for the very first summer because I was very concerned about getting the plants established underneath the harsh Kansas summer on top of a building. I was a pessimist. I didn't think it was going to go. It did. It is thriving. It's just kind of a bummer that we can't see it because it's on top of Seton Hall and we can't get up to see it. But again, looking for pockets in the urban environment where we can recapture natural function, store a little bit of that water, slow it down, and reduce the possibilities for those horrific erosion events in our open channels. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up here and then I have some questions, but some things to think about. So again, I said we kind of got an up view here. So it shows you a little bit of research, but just kind of some things to think about. Can we develop land for multiple purposes? We have the luxury in the Midwest that we have just been able to spread out. I don't think that luxury is going to last that much longer if we think about our natural resources. So how do we, as we create dense populations, also create multiple functional landscapes? So if we're doing stormwater management and we're looking to optimize stormwater management using a more natural system, can that natural system also be a food production system? Food production outside, or potentially even those food production systems like the aquaponics system where we're taking some water away from that hydrograph and that erosive energy. Could we maybe do energy production? Could the vegetation that we use be used for biofuels? So could we think of a way, and again, we're not talking huge pieces of acreage, but if we had that scattered across the landscape in those pockets, could we be getting biodiesel? Could we maybe use the flow of that water to create low amounts of hydroelectric energy as that water's flowing through pipes? Probably enough to charge some of our electric cars. So if you think about some charging stations in conjunction with probably solar panels. I think the very easiest one is recreation. So as we think about our parks and our open spaces that are so important for our kind of our well-being and our health, can we integrate how we do stormwater management in that? Granted, there may be times of the year then that some of that park's not available because of flooding, but it may be a good way to help get both of those functions. And then as we think about that, can we optimize ecological function? Can we go back to that concept of ecosystem services, and can we look at these systems and see which ecosystem services we can reintroduce into what we call the grayscape, into the urban environment, through the reintroduction of these pockets of mini ecosystems? Can we continue to protect our natural resources? Can we reduce soil erosion by reducing the energy of water that we see traveling down our urban waterways? Can we, which would then also gain storage in our reservoir systems where we're silting in? You know, we have a lot of rippling effect if we can reduce that erosion. And then I think at the end it's human health. So not only do we have some of those ecosystem services coming in, but with those green environments, we're pulling pollution out of the air. I mean, we're doing a lot of good things, not to mention that it's a lot more fun to be out and walking through the park than it is to be out and walking down, you know, just the street with no greenscape. So, like I said, kind of a big system thinking thing, but I mean, we've only really just begun to understand the Earth as a system. I think we've done a lot of conversion of this system before we really went, I wonder what this conversion of land is doing to the overall system. And obviously urban areas fit into that, and so now those systems are very, very different than the natural landscape that we started with. But now, how do we as scientists and engineers start to reignite kind of those natural processes or reinvest those into the urban landscape? And so this is the Olathe campus. This is where we're actually housed, and my program coordinator, Joan Levins, runs the show in Olathe when I'm here most of the time teaching and doing research like a normal faculty member. But then you can also, if you've got more questions, you can contact me. And that's a little bit about urban water issues and the Urban Water Institute. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
have any regulations from the city or the other types of government in the county level, like for the new developments? Does the hydrologist, I don't know if we have a county hydrologist, but does they look for the hydrology of the new development, or they is it possible to make it in the United States?
The question is if we have any policies or regulations that would kind of impact the hydrology of a system. And yes. Now the problem is that the policies and the regulations, the ordinances that we have are locally specific. So the city of Manhattan can set its stormwater management policies, which can be very different than, say, Topeka or even rural Riley County or Kansas City. We have done quite a good push to get a few things kind of adopted fairly statewide. Some of them started in Kansas City with a riparian buffer ordinance, or just a setback from our drainage system. That one picture near Candlewood and the Seco Park, if houses hadn't been put right on top of that, at least that the person wouldn't be losing their house. That is becoming fairly common. There is a requirement for a developer when they develop a piece of land that they must contain the difference in that 2-year precipitation event on site. So if we start from a natural system and we see the amount of runoff that would have left the site in a natural system, we're now going to put Super Walmart on this site. Super Walmart must put some type of storage facility on its site that would contain the difference in runoff from pre-Super Walmart to post-Super Walmart. That is pretty ubiquitous across all of the United States. But other than that, you get into all kinds of crazy different policies, some that work for you and help you, like the riparian buffer, some that work horrifically against you. Yesterday I was in Kansas City and we were talking about the number of parking spaces per square foot of building. And so for a middle school, they were telling me that we needed over 800 parking spaces. Oh, no. We don't need 800 parking spaces at the middle school. So again, we've kind of gotten into where for good business, we should have a lot of parking per square foot of building. But for good environmental management, we should all be riding our bikes, probably. But we certainly shouldn't have 800 parking spots at a middle school. So there's some policies like that that get you in trouble.
Going on with Vladimir's question, in Manhattan, can you provide some examples of how developers have stored that difference? Because I don't see them very readily as I drive around town.
Okay, so this is an ordinance, and I'm trying to think when it came into effect in Manhattan. It's about a decade. So if you go to some of the newer developments around town, and you will see the most common method, and I also argued with an engineer yesterday on this as well. The most common method is one large pond in the corner of the lot at the outlet of the development. And we have those in Manhattan. That is the pond that one of the groups is working on up in Miller Ranch area. Okay, so that was the idea again. One pond, bottom of the hill at that time, kind of, sorta. Now it's I have a colleague that's building a house right down to the dam. I'm like, ooh, but okay. So one big pond. Over on the east side of town, kind of back in where they've done a lot of the housing, there's kind of a pond network system that goes through there. There's some detention systems over near Target. And so you typically don't look at them and think of them as an amenity. You typically maybe not even notice what they're for. Because it doesn't look like there's a plan. It's just kind of the big open area that's lined in rock at the edge of the development, which is not my favorite.
So we've not gotten to the point in Manhattan where we're really considering ecosystem services routinely from a development perspective.
No.
I'm with the K-State Planning Office, and we have a policy in place that we cannot increase runoff on any project that's built. And so That's okay. So the new business college has a detention system that's underneath the parking lot now.
Yeah.
And we have several detention basins on campus. And NBAF had several built with that project. So we've actually reduced what we did have for runoff quite a bit. And but we continue to work on it. It's a continual battle. But we made some progress. The problem with it is that we had problems before, and so if we say we're not increasing runoff, we're not fixing the problem. We're just not making it worse.
Yeah, and I should point out, I appreciate a lot of the efforts that campus has made because we've done some things to try to be a little different. Manhattan as a city is trying in some respects. Lenexa has done quite a bit. Topeka has done quite a bit. So it's kind of catching on a little bit to do what we would call a distributed water management system. Some of it is very hardcore engineering still and requires still quite a bit of grayscape, just kind of because we have a built environment and we're trying to work amongst constraints that we've put upon ourselves due to the last 50 to 100 years of development. Some of the new subdivisions, you can be pretty creative and get some really nice kind of landscape function that also serves as your stormwater. But it's an interesting battle because you've got, so in campus we're dealing with a pretty built out environment. With developers, you've got to kind of convince them that they're going to make money over switching. And, I would, most of the time the lot value goes up if you have nice outdoor amenities. But we're so used to not doing it that way that we haven't really embraced that. And that was yesterday in Kansas City. I'm working on a rebuild of this junior high in Shawnee Mission. And the engineer, he's like, well, if I do it the way you're saying, I'm going to have like multiple hydrographs to calculate. And I was like, yeah, you will, but it's okay. And I said to him, what model are you using? He goes, well, I do it on a spreadsheet. And I'm like, we need to get you back to school to learn the model so that it's not quite so complicated to tie together 10 hydrographs.
What middle school, just out of curiosity?
Okay, I don't know what the new school's going to be. It's really near 71st and Antioch. And it's going to be kind of a hybrid. They're tearing down the school that's there, and it's going to be hybrid administration and different 21st century programs. Okay. Any other questions?
All right. Well, let's thank Dr. Hutchinson. Thank you.